Good afternoon. I'm Robert Dijkgraaf, Director of the Institute and Leon Levy Professor, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to the Institute today for a public lecture by Professor Patrick Geary. And as always, at the end of the lecture there will be a question and answer period, and then followed by a reception in the common room of Fuld Hall, to which you are all kindly invited. As I said, today's speaker is Professor Patrick Geary, professor in the School of Historical Studies since 2012. And in fact, I remember very well, he started his tenure here, I think must be January the 2nd, 2012, which was also the first day I actually, in my new capacity, kind of walked around. And so the first person I saw was Patrick. So which, of course, led to a serious case of imprinting on my case. So Patrick is a leading historian in the Middle Ages, whose research has opened new ways to understand, interpret, and define the medieval past. His work extends over a vast range of topics in medieval history, both chronologically and conceptually, from religiosity to language, ethnicity, social structure, and political organization. And as you know, it is a common feature, I think, for all the schools here at the Institute, but particularly in the School of Historical Studies. It's very interesting to see kind of the background and nationalities of the professors and the topics they study. So we have a Danish scholar studying the Islamic culture, an Italian studying Mongolia, an Englishman studying the Netherlands. So I was very happy to report that we have an American studying European medieval history. Patrick earned his PhD in medieval studies from Yale University, and prior to coming to our institute, he was a distinguished professor of history at the University of California, Los Angeles, and a former director of both the UCLA Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies and the UCLA Humanities Consortium. In addition to faculty appointments at Princeton University and the University of Florida, Patrick has served as professor of history, a Robert M. Conway Director of the Medieval Institute at the University of Notre Dame. As I said, his scholarship has made significant contributions to a number of areas of medieval social and cultural history. Many of the essays and books have become standard literature in the field, with translations into multiple languages. All of these Professor Geary himself controls, including Dutch, actually. Patrick's outstanding work in the field has led to many major fellowships and honors. I just mentioned a few: a research fellowship at the Max Planck Institute, a Guggenheim Fellow, a fellow at the Hungarian Institute for Advanced Study, and recently the Annelies Meyer Research Award from the Humboldt Foundation. He also directs the St. Gall Plan project, which provides online tool for the study of Carolingian monasticism. Currently, and I think we hear much more about it this afternoon, Patrick is leading a major project that studies the migration of European societies, north and south of the Alps, through the analysis of ancient DNA in Longobard cemeteries in Central Europe and Italy. And it's a terrific example, I think, how these days the humanities are branching out across the academic world, including also into the natural sciences. In his lecture today, he will look at these conceptual, technical, and computational challenges, many different ways of doing research, using genetic data to help answer fundamental questions about the dynamics of populations in a crucial period of European history that actually have an important impact also in terms of national identity. And so in many ways, I think this is research that's cutting edge and kind of taking risks also in terms of just the cultural and political ramifications. So needless to say, we're very happy and proud that Patrick joined our faculty, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome him, and I hope you join me in welcoming him here to the stage. Patrick Geary.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Robert. If I was the first person you saw, you were probably the first person that I saw. And though I think I may have seen Charlotte shortly before I saw you. So you and your family are deeply imprinted on my memory of my first hours here at the Institute. Rethinking Barbarian Invasions. Let's begin with the classic image. when as a flood the collection of powerful mountain streams, long restrained in a high valley, are now and then guided by weak dams, finally breaks free and inundates the lower plain. Wave follows upon wave, current upon current, until all become one bright sea that, slowly subsiding, leaves everywhere traces of devastation, but also flowering meadows, which it had renewed with fertility. Such was the effect of the famous migration of the Nordic peoples into the provinces of the Roman Empire. This is the classic statement of the Völkerwanderung, the wandering of the peoples, by Johann Gottfried Herder, the great German philosopher, poet of Sturm und Drang. This image of devastation, yes, but actually, ultimately, fertility, new blood for a tired Europe, a tired Roman Empire. And this image of barbarian migrations that renew are a strong current within a romantic tradition from the early 19th century forward. Images of the Hungarian migration. Note the warriors, okay, there may be a little fighting and a little trouble, but especially down here, of course, we have the peasant with his oxen coming to make fertile the Pannonian plains. Or the Germanic invasions. There are always oxen, apparently. He's got his sword, he's got his shield, but he's looking back to his wife in the ox cart with the ox. And this is romantic that goes to the present. Children's books, always an ox, this time white, it may be meaningful, and this happy nuclear family on their way to the Roman Empire to renew it. So we have this image of the barbarian, very nice looking barbarians. They look a lot like mathematicians to me, but coming down into Europe to renew the tired world. But of course, there is another image of this. It is not the Völkerwanderung, but the barbarian invasions. The image somehow more typical for France and Italy for some strange reason, that sees this as ultimately destructive, raw brutality, not at all disguised sexuality, power that is only power to destroy and not to create. The sack of Rome by Alaric, destruction, exactly why they're dressed this way is not clear to me. I don't see any oxen in the picture. Well, you know, we can joke about this, you know, well, we wanted literature, music, art, we were starved for these things, looking for some poems, sorry if we broke some stuff. Well, we can joke about this, but the other image of the barbarian invasions is pretty powerful. And a recent book by a British historian we'll return to in a minute kind of says it all. The fall of Rome and the end of civilization. Well, that's all very nice, but these days, we're not even sure that these things happened. We're not sure what went on in this period. Were there barbarian migrations? And this is not just an academic question, is it? This is not just a question that dusty people like myself are asking about the 4th, 5th, 6th century. Who might have said this? Rome did not fall overnight. It fell gradually. They scarcely noticed what was happening until it was too late. Germanic barbarians attracted by prosperity, crossing, looking for new life. This is seen as even something positive in the empire. But then, on December the 31st of the year 406, the Rhine froze, and tens of thousands of Germanic barbarians crossed the river, flooded the empire, and went on a rampage, destroying the city. In 410, Rome was sacked. If Europe falls, it will fall because, like ancient Rome, it no longer believes in the superiority of its own civilization. It will fall because it foolishly believes that all cultures are equal. and that consequently there is no reason why we should fight for our culture in order to preserve it. Geert Wilders' address in Rome, in honor of Robert, of course, and our Dutch colleagues, 2 years ago. This is not an academic topic. Barbarian invasions, barbarian migrations, renewal of the empire. Is this a lesson of history that we need to learn today? Well, as a historian, I would say, of course not. The lessons of history are not like this. What goes on in the 4th and 5th centuries are not telling us what is going on today. And Geert Wilders, in his determination to block Islamic migration into Europe, to ban the Quran in Europe as a subversive book, is not going to be the best interpreter of the barbarian migrations. But we have to remember when we work on these questions that this is exactly where it's going. Or it's going in the direction of political correctness as though it never happened. And maybe it didn't happen. In fact, scholars right now, not people like Professor Wilders, aren't really sure if the barbarian migrations ever took place. This actually was not an old idea. It starts really, the first time people talk about migrations of peoples is really in the 16th, 17th century, and then they weren't even talking about this. And today, serious scholars are not quite clear what goes on. Brian Ward Perkins, our friend that we saw with the fall of Rome and the end of civilization, has no question. Yes, primitive barbarians came into the empire and they messed it up. Well, Peter Heather in London, in that direction, but he talks about incursions rather than barbarian invasions. He's a little bit more reticent about his language. Michael Borgolte in Berlin, who has recently been studying medieval migrations within the general context of migration history, says, well, really, these groups coming into the empire had no effect. What mattered was diffusion of some groups, like the Slavs, into Europe, but these Visigoths, Lombards, Vandals, and so forth, there were no migrations. Guy Halsall at York says, no, they weren't any migrations. They were civil wars, and there were armies that used barbarian troops in their civil wars, but the migrations never took place. This is a figment of Herder and others' imaginations that has somehow run amok in society. Well, we can understand why contemporary European politicians want to play with this motif of howling barbarians coming from the north or coming from the south. It's less clear why supposedly serious historians like myself are not really sure whether this took place, and if it did, was there a major demographic impact? Or was it a smaller impact? Were these peoples in the sense of men, women, children, animals, oxen, slaves, coming in massive numbers and having a demographic effect? Or were these small military units made up of men who entered the empire in the service of Rome or on raiding expeditions and were very quickly absorbed into the local populations? Why don't we know? We're historians. Isn't that our job? Well, some would say it's ideological. Some say the politically correct historians want to talk about the transformation of the Roman world rather than the fall of Rome, while the xenophobes want to talk about howling barbarians. But that's all very good, but there's also a basic problem of evidence. For example, I'm going to be talking a lot about the Longobardi, the Lombards. So I'm going to use some Longobard examples from the beginning. And here is the closest to a contemporary eyewitness account of the Longobard invasion of Italy, as it's generally understood. In 568, King Alboin of the Lombards supposedly invades Italy. This is a text of Marius of Avranches, he is an exact contemporary of this. He's writing probably about 580, but he's alive at this time. He's probably drawing directly on materials written in Italy. We have his text in exactly one manuscript, and this is the entire text. This is everything that this eyewitness account, the closest to the event, this is our best evidence about Alboin and his invasion of Italy. And I don't know what it says. Okay, in this year, Alboin, king of the Lombards, with his army, leaving and burning Pannonia, they burned down their homes, he says, presumably so they couldn't go back or that others couldn't get them or whatever, with their women, so it's the entire people, men, women, and children, and those oxen, both brown and white, occupy Italy in Farah. We'll come back to that. And there, some perished by disease, some by famine, and a few by the sword. In that same year, they presumed to enter the frontiers of Gaul, where a multitude of the captives of this people were for sale. Who perished and who got sold? I don't know. Ali mordo, ali fame, non nulli gladio interrupti sunt. Maybe some of the Lombards sound like they lost. Sound like they invaded, and some of them died of famine, some of starvation, some of them cut down. And shortly after, you could buy Lombards on the market. Or maybe it means that they invaded, and there some people, meaning the local Italians, were killed, and maybe they were selling slaves, meaning Italians, in Gaul. You could read it either way. So either as a great successful invasion or as a disaster. Well, we have written texts like this, very useful for clarifying things for us. And then we also have archaeological texts, the material culture of this world, of this lost world. Archaeologists have been digging around for a century and a half, looking at the evidence of the Longobarд migration. Well, we begin because Roman texts tell us that there's a people called the Longobardi living in the lower Elba in the 1st century. They then vanish. For 3 centuries, not quite sure where they are, if they still exist. But then we start getting certain kinds of material in here in what is today the Czech Republic, the Moravian region, southern Czech Republic. Then it comes across the Danube, the region of between Vienna and Budapest, a century. And we start seeing kinds of stuff from sites. This stuff, hard to know. People say that there are great similarities, but I don't have enough imagination to see it. But here, yeah, okay, these S-form fibulae, and then later on, we find these things showing up in Italy. Well, is that evidence that the people who really like these S-form fibulae started out here, they moved down here, then they came across here? Or that these kinds of things were popular and they moved back and forth, as you can have cultural transmission, not not people. You don't necessarily mean that because you have these same objects that the people move with them, but it may be cultural transfer. Maybe the marketers were active here, selling stuff up here, selling stuff down here. The chronology gets a little complicated because there are different forms of these. There's supposed to be a particular type up here. Then later on you have a farm here, later on here. Unfortunately, in between, in Slovenia, we find some of this farm that are supposed to be earlier than they get here rather than here. So it's a little bit problematic. I often use the example, you find this stuff, this typical stuff, that means that people moved. It's sort of like saying that if you look in American garages in 1,000 years, we will see a massive migration of Japanese into Princeton based on what we find in our garages. Okay, well, what's happening here is what some people refer to as the circular argument, the ethnic paradigm.
Okay, we have texts, and we read them literally if we could understand what they're saying. And there's some other texts, more important texts about the Lombards, but it's written 200 years later, based on lost sources, maybe. So we read the text literally. It's, oh, well, they were here. The Romans say they're here, here, here. Okay. Then we draw from these written sources a map. They must have gone like that, because that's pretty much what the texts say. So we're going to dig around, and we find, oh, well, they must have inhabited, this must have been their territories. And they must have been up here, and they moved like this. So we begin to fit an ethnic map of these people, and then with our shovels, whatever we find there, say, that must be Longobard. That must be what distinguishes the Longobards. Rather than that's something the Longobards like, but a lot of people did as well, and maybe they weren't Longobards anyway. And then when we dig around and we find a corpse, that is a Longobard. And how do we know that that's a Longobard? Because he had these things, and those things we know are typically Longobard, and they had to be because they came from the territory of the Longobard. So you see where we're going with this. Same sort of problem comes up in other situations. If we take a look at typical barbarian period jewelry to identify national or ethnic groups as though what distinguished people was their jewelry, like saying, well, progressives and Tea Party people, you can tell them from their burial custom. I have my doubts. We should look, but no, never mind. So, okay, here's a kind of beautiful sword that's typically identified with Franks. The Franks are up here. Whoops, well, we got it over here where the Lombards were from. We have in Central Europe, and whoa, all the way over here. Well, that's not going to help us very much with Lombards or with Franks or anybody else. So take a look at another specialty kind of sword. Oh, that's really helpful. Now they're in England. I thought those were Anglo-Saxons. They're up here where they're supposed to be Franks. They're also where they're supposed to be Saxons. They're over here where they're supposed to be, I don't know what, maybe Longobards or Jeppards, and they're down in Italy as well. And so forth. With certain kinds of belt buckles, they go all the way across the region. Certain kinds of special belt buckles, they're all over the place. Even Roman stuff that ought to stay home, like Byzantine form helmets, maybe these are simply Roman soldiers, and this is the stuff that they use. So we run into this problem that our material culture isn't terribly helpful, our written culture isn't very helpful, so we desperately need some other kind of source to help us understand what is going on in this period. And so many people want to turn to genetic investigation, to genomic investigation, because what will this do? This will tell us who you really are. And this is just as dangerous as the kinds of things I've been suggesting before. But right now we know that we are in a genomic revolution. For $99, you can find out who you really are. How many of you have had your genetic test? Come on, be honest. Yes, you know who you really are. Cut through all of that culture and double talk by historians, and you know who you really are because you spit into a bottle and shipped it off. So a breakthrough for you. Discover your ethnicity. Your ethnicity in your genes. Maybe. Who do you think you are? Who are? So the idea is, well, genetics is going to tell us who these people are. Now we'll know who the real Lombards are. Hungarian politicians suggested upon the victory of the current Fidesz party that now, thanks to genetics, we will know who the real Magyars are. But the reality is that genetics requires as much theoretical, interpretive work as any other kind of research. And the idea that genotype equals ethnic group, a cultural construct, a sense of identity, is completely misleading and potentially very dangerous. This danger of essentializing to, in a biological way, to divide people, to eliminate the complexity of the past into some kind of sharp, objective identity A racial essentializing is not what serious geneticists mean, though some people will turn a buck on things like this. And it certainly is not going to be helpful to history. Let's remember everything we used to know about DNA in 30 seconds, and my apologies to the people here who actually do this stuff. You know, we have two kinds. We have uniparental. We have the mitochondrial DNA, mother, 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 all the way back to Eve. The Y chromosome inherited directly from the father. These do not recombine. Well, Y chromosome does a little bit, but let's pretend that it basically does not. That's what most people study. That's where you go back. Your mitochondria goes back to Africa, to wherever, and you find out who you are, or your father's line. And a lot of studies, historical studies, have focused on these uniparental markers, tracing them back. It's like picking up a 500-page book, reading one page, and writing a review. Now, I know lots of scholars do that, but even those of us who do it know it's not the right way to do it. Then there's the autosomal, the nuclear DNA, all the rest of the DNA that is inherited from all of our ancestors. Then we get the whole crowd in the room, not just mom, 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 dad, 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 but everybody back there, all of these mixings. And it's subject to recombination. So in every generation, it may change. It doesn't all change in every generation, but the possibilities are enormous. Okay, so what are we doing when we say, okay, we're going to use genetics for history? Well, we have to sequence the DNA. That means that we have to get DNA from living or dead specimens. The living are faster to move, but it's easier to get it from them. It's in better condition. The dead, they're just there. But as soon as an organism dies, the DNA begins to break down, and it gets contaminated, particularly by bacteria, by anything that has ever touched it, by any archaeologist or whatever. So there are all kinds of technical problems, but you've got to get your DNA. Then you have to decide what genes you're going to study. They have to be amplified so that their signal stands out over the 3,200 megabase genome. You know, over the billions of bits of data. What are we going to look for here? Well, we're going to resequence the genome so that the single nucleotide polymorphism, SNPs, we'll be talking a little bit, these repeating sequences of microsatellites, these units can be identified, because those are the units we could try to work with for the most part. 10 million SNPs, we're not going to do them all, so we have to make some decisions. So these then are sampled and compared to models that predict divergence going out or convergence back to a common ancestor. But these are models, and there are lots of ways the models could be constructed with the same data, the same genetic diversity. There are different ways of building different models. So you have to, if you're building models, it's a very complicated thing. And then you have to analyze, what does it mean? Otherwise, you're just looking at data and making up stories, which some people do. Who does this? Well, there have been some very interesting studies of attempts to study the migration period using genetic data. Some of the earliest and most interesting have concentrated on the Anglo-Saxons. It's an island, it's somewhat isolated, and there have been a number of studies. Michael Wheel has led several of these, looking at Y chromosomal evidence of Anglo-Saxon mass migration. Did a lot of Saxons come? Did a few Saxons come? Did they just send postcards and say, please learn English to the Britons? And they conclude the very complicated study looking at different regions, East Anglia, but then comparing them with Frisia, Norway, and then also with Wales to see where do the Y chromosomes seem most similar. This is all modern DNA. This is taken from living people. And they conclude there's a massive Y chromosomal replacement, and there are various arguments about how that happened. Either they killed all the Britons, or more likely that they had a marital advantage, a reproductive advantage for centuries, and gradually the Saxon Y chromosomes pushed out the rest in eastern England, so that they're more similar to the continent than they are to Wales. Unfortunately, other studies using different data sets say, oh no, there's actually no difference at all. So it's a bit of a problem, and much of the problem relies on the difficulty of using modern DNA that I'll come back to. On the continent, there have not been as many studies, but there's a very recent, very interesting study by two people at USC. Having been at UCLA, I naturally distrust them, but they're looking at nuclear DNA taken from modern samples, and they're trying to find patterns of identity by descent blocks within the DNA and trying to date them and trying to look at different levels 500 years, 1,000, 15, 2,000 years ago, and see whether there are patterns that might emerge and then how one might explain those patterns. And their explanations is the Huns did it. Well, both of these studies are interesting in that they are trying to answer questions about migration using modern DNA. I have a lot of trouble with that. The assumption in both cases is that the modern DNA you're collecting goes right back to the same ancestors you're trying to study. So there's been massive immobile population back to this migration period. There have been no major population movements, which historians would say is not clear. Europe is always in motion. There have been no major demographic constrictions creating bottlenecks and a loss of DNA, such as the Black Death, which I think still did happen, killing between 1/3 and 2/3 of Europe's population. So what survives in Europe's gene pool is not what was there in the 6th century or even the 13th century. It's also assuming that these people actually go back that direction, that deep, which is not at all clear. The 2 grandparents or 4 grandparents from a village someplace, one assumes that their family have been there forever. That's denying history. Now, it may be true, but it's a leap of faith to say for 1,500 years these people have simply been there. We know that there is motion, there is movement within peasant societies across the modern period, across the medieval period, and before the Middle Ages. There's been a lot of movement, so that this modern DNA is problematic. It's problematic in a study like this for another reason. This European data set that a lot of people use is wonderful because there's very rich data. It's collected for medical reasons, and so it's available. One of my problems, as you'll see, is getting ancient DNA is very expensive. This is available. But all of this is from people who happen to wander through one hospital in Lucerne, Switzerland, and said, oh, I'm from Italy, I'm from Sweden, I'm from Estonia, and so forth, and gave a sample. And these points that locate them are located on a post-1945 European map. So Italian DNA could be Sicily, or it could be Sud Tyrol. French DNA could be Brittany, it could be Alsace, which might have been Germany at another time. It could be Lille, it could be Provence. It's just French. German, post-1945, could be Rostock, it could be Passau, it could be Munich, it could be Leipzig. It's just German. So there are a lot of problems with the data that they start with. The science may be beautiful, but it may be garbage in, garbage out in terms of meaningful results. There are also problems here about after they have these patterns, how do they interpret them? In fact, they cite 3 history textbooks as their historical basis for saying this is to be explained by the Huns. Not a lot of deep collaboration with anyone. So modern DNA, I don't like it. I mean, I'm glad I have it, but I would not want to trust it for my history work. So we go to ancient DNA. Actually go to the people who are trying to study. Forget about trying to get this modern stuff and say, well, their ancestors probably were the people. Let's dig up the ancestors. This is a real problem, too. This is one of the more famous studies, or I would say infamous. Some people think it's great. A study not of Western migration, but of Central Asia, the Xiongnu, the people who are not the ancestors of the Huns, but some people think they are, people that Nicola di Cosmo loves and works with. And this archaeological team digging up this body, which they think is from a Xiongnu period, but there are even questions there, they say, we showed for the first time that an Indo-European was present in the Xiongnu Empire. And they go on to say, this West Eurasian male in the Xiongnu Empire might show racial tolerance of the Xiongnu. This is wonderful that genetic research shows a kinder, gentler, multicultural empire of the Xiongnu. What did they base this on? Well, their friend has a particular, belongs to a haplogroup R1A1, and if we look at it on a map, well, yeah, it's more common in Europe and South Asia. It's a probability thing. It's more common. But, oh dear, it does exist in Asia as well. It's possible that some distant ancestors of this individual may have come from Europe, or maybe not, but that he was an Indo-European, which is a linguistic category, that he spoke an Indo-European language, is absolutely terrifying. So far as I know, the gene for Indo-European languages has not yet been isolated. Now, I know that some of my geneticist colleagues may be here, and if you've found the gene for English, please let me know. There are a lot of people who could use it, and the gene for American is probably a subcategory. So this is a problem. So what should we do with ancient DNA? Let me start with what we should not do. I give you, and this is for Professor Helmut Reimitz from the university, this is the great sample of Frankish identity. Childeric, who is the king of the Salian Franks, dies in 480. His tomb is found in the 17th century. Here's his ring, the picture. I wanted to draw a line to show where the tooth fit, but you can use your imagination. And we have his wisdom tooth. How we have it is a long story, and I don't want to get into that, but we've got the guy's wisdom tooth. It's in the Cabinet des Médailles, the collection of precious objects in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. If the French government momentarily had a brain freeze and allowed us to drill into it, and if we could actually get some DNA out of it, and if we could actually sequence it and completely sequence his entire genome, what would we know about Frankish identity? Absolutely nothing. It would not tell us whether this Childeric, who, by the way, was the father of King Clovis, the first king of what would eventually be the Merovingian kingdom, eventually the Carolingian kingdom, eventually France and Germany. So this is the father of the first king of, the French would say, France. Would this tell us who the Franks are? This foundational figure? Well, not really. It wouldn't tell us whether he thought he was a Roman or whether he thought that he was a Frank or what that might have meant to him. It wouldn't tell us where he's from. It wouldn't tell us where his people had migrated from, if they had migrated from anywhere. Taken in isolation, it would tell us very, very little. It would only give us one person's genome floating out there in space, and would tell us nothing about identity. The Franks have a legend that they were Trojans. They left Troy when the Romans, Aeneas left, well, so the Franks, and they ended up, well, maybe he's got some Turkish DNA, this would be meaningless. But there are a lot of these studies that go for the high-profile person. You know about the Richard III found in a parking lot in Leicester. Wonderful discovery. What do we now know? Now we know that Richard III is dead. I was worried about that. We also know that he did not ascend into heaven. And given his life, no one is really surprised at that, so that he has a body. Beyond that, does it mean that he killed the two princes? Not. These are great fun, and maybe they can use it to raise money. And they're very, very good geneticists in Leicester who are working on this, and they're working that angle. And I hope they get the money, because I'm looking for it too. But these discoveries are not really going to tell us very much that as an historian I want to know. And will we find out that he has descendants today? Well, of course he has descendants today. High elite men in that period could have lots of gene flow, as they call sex in the genetic biz, and chances are that everybody in this room is a descendant of this tooth. But what does that really tell us? So what should we do? How can we do it better? Well, I've got a project going tracing longbird migration, although it's really not Longobarд migration. That's a shorthand. I have no interest in Longobards. I don't know if they ever existed. But through DNA. Thus far, I've gotten funding from the Anneliese Meyer grant that Robert Dijkgraaf mentioned from the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation, which has gotten us started, and we're spluttering along with the generosity of the Germans. So I've put together an international team, an international and truly interdisciplinary team. We've got archaeologists in Hungary, in Germany, in the Czech Republic, in Italy, who are working with us to get the bones and also the analysis of the cemetery, because we're not just interested in bones and teeth, we're interested in people in the entire cemetery. We have a team of geneticists. The primary work is going on actually in the laboratory of David Carmarelli in Florence, but also with assistance of Guido Barbugiani in Ferrara, who's one of the major figures in working with ancient DNA and their students, but also geneticists in the US and so forth. We have physical anthropologists, because we're interested in isotopic profiles of these materials, because we need models, so we need to look at what isotopic analysis might give us in terms of ideas, and then just to mess things up, there's some historians like me involved in. So we're really trying to work together. And what are we doing? Well, we have acquired the remains of 600 people, soon to be 800 when we get our bodies from the Czech Republic. And we are in the process of extracting, amplifying, and sequencing, doing basic mitochondrial DNA sequencing, traditional sequencing, from these 800 figures. Now, thus far, we have done, just as a quick test, the mitochondria of one section of the mitochondria from a series of people from the Piedmont region of Italy. We've run some very, very basic tests. This is sort of a network analysis. This is a very, very basic, quick analysis of the mitochondrial connections. If you don't see any pattern here, you've got it. That's exactly right. There's not much that we're going to learn from the mitochondria, and for reasons that become obvious, I doubt that that would tell us very much about migration anyway. So what we need to do is to get the nuclear DNA. We need to get into the depths of the DNA, which is enormously expensive and for which I frankly don't have the money. Certainly not for 800 samples at about $1,000 a run. So we're starting with 2 villages, one in Italy near Turin and one on the Lake Balaton. And these are sites that have been very carefully excavated. We're getting isotopic analysis so we can look at them, kind of triangulate from various directions. There are some similarities. There are these kinds of row burials that seem to be typical of this period. This is 6th century barbarian type burials. Some of these they try to date roughly comparable, and you find stuff in them that are similar. These kinds of pins women wear, or fibulae as they're called, you see here and here. There's some kind of connection, but style, whatever, we don't know how they might run together. What we want to do then is to do very detailed analysis of the genetic material we can get out of it. 10 years ago, this would have been completely impossible. Today, it may be possible using what is called next generation sequencing. We're looking for 5 megabase, we're only 0.2% of the whole genome. If we did the whole genome, I would have to sell my house to do 1 sample. But we're going to focus on 2% of the genome, looking at what are called 5,000 of these SNPs that are known generally in population demographics to identify regions. This sort of thing that you test when you send this stuff off to a lab. This might help us look at recent movement, maybe. It also is useful for looking at kinship, because we'd like to know what is the organization, who's buried next to whom. Are these relatives? Is this a kindred group or not? Then we're going to take a look at 5,000, 1,000 by regions of contiguous sequence that we can apply population demographics to test competing models that would give us an idea of how this population came to be in a more sophisticated way. Then we're going to look at some areas that might have something to do with medicine, disease. This is a period of plague, because we're hoping to lure some medical money into this. But what do we want to know? To what extent are these Longobardic and non-Longobardic seminaries structured? How are they organized? Kinship, gender, social status? There are all kinds of arguments among historians. Well, let's just see who's there. What is the relationship between individuals buried in these cemeteries? And we're also looking at cemeteries that formally don't seem to be the same. So they say they're not Longobard. Well, maybe none of them are Longobard, but it's a different cultural tradition. Does cultural tradition map with genetic? Is there any reason that are they similar? Was there gene flow between these groups? And if so, is it sex bias? There's some indications that when migrant men move around, they collect women from wherever they're going. This image of the husband, wife, and the ox moving through Europe may not be right. Maybe the men moved, they picked up women along the way, one way or another. And so we may find that these are very different groups. And then, is there genetic continuity between Pannonia, that's the Hungarian, Czech, Austrian region, and the Italian sites? Not saying that they're Lombards, but saying, is there a population movement in Europe in this period? What do we do with this? Well, once we get this, we have to analyze our data. And there are various ways to do that. The first are called unsupervised. That means when you let your lab assistant in, they lock the door and they just run amok, I guess. But it also means we're not testing alternative hypotheses about that. They're just sort of eyeballing it, trying to make interpretations, maybe some statistics. You're looking at individuals. You're looking at genetic distance of individuals. You're trying to see, can you map out something about these people? And it's a good way to begin. This example that I showed earlier is that. There's no model implied here, really. It's just trying to see how these things relate. But this is fine, and with these, mitochondria, Y chromosome, it can be useful looking at ancestry of a fairly narrow sort, but it is really not terribly helpful for bigger questions about demographic history. For that, we've got to look at models. It's model building, and that's why this exact science is really just looking at models, just like historians. We build models of what my text meant. Well, we're building models of what perhaps this meant. Here, we're testing hypotheses against each other. We're not just looking at data, finding patterns, and telling stories, which sadly is what often is done at the end of very elegant scientific analyses. They open a textbook to tell a story about it. The Huns did it. These must be Saxons. But rather, we're trying to build models, and we're testing them. Population's a unit of analysis, but what a population isn't that clear. And you can create, theoretically, you can have data sets that are hypothetical data sets, imaginary data sets, then you can test them against real data to see if these kinds of hypothetical models correspond at all to the actual data that we're getting. And then we can actually get probability values. Rather than saying, it looks kind of like this, we can say it is more probable that this story fits our data better than this other story, which sounds pretty weak, but it's better than what we've done before. And then we can estimate parameters. And unfortunately, we can't test all possible models, which would be infinite, particularly when we get into autosomal DNA. But we have to use prior knowledge to figure these things out. Now, that means communication with the archaeologists, the physical anthropologists, historians, to limit the possibilities of these models. What was the original population size? We don't know. We have to guess. What is the new population size? We don't know. Who was up there before? How many were down there later? we have to build lots of models. This is a very, very simple example that one of the people in the team, Silvia Girotto in Ferrara, has done with the mitochondrial material. Very, very simple thing. 2 models. The people we've dug up are the direct ancestors of the people living in the region today. Oh, there is no connection between the people we're living today. Pretty crude kind of modeling, but something. So what do? So you run 50,000 simulations for each model with different data sets. With Turin, a great big city where many of the people have come in, and you have 2 models. You have the red model. Remember, red model is model 1, the direct descendants. The blue model, number 2, there's no connection. Oh, there's no connection here. Probably no connection in this little village. There may be some connection here. Dubious here, it's not entirely. So 50,000 tests, and the best we can come up with is some maybes. Mitochondrial DNA for these purposes is not going to be terribly successful, but this is the kind of modeling that we're supposed to do. So what do we do with this data? Well, we construct these models. We compare our models with those proposed by the cultural anthropologists. No, we know that these people move because we have these burial rites, these objects, and so forth. Well, let's take a look at how that would fit. Physical anthropologists, isotopic analysis indicates whether people are indigenous or exotic to a region. Compare our models with those proposed by textual historians. What did Marius actually mean? Who was winning against whom, and who got sold? And then we try to create a model that is a model of models. This is truly collaborative work. This is not plugging things in, but this is what we're trying to do. Now, with all of this effort, what are we going to get from this that we wouldn't get if we just sat down and learned our Latin better and read Marius a little more carefully? Well, let me tell you what we will not learn. Who these people really were. That's not something we're going to find out. Who are you? Only you can say that, and your genetics are not going to answer that question. Did the Lombards migrate from northern Italy to northern Europe to Italy? Did they even migrate from Pannonia? We may find out if some people move. Of course, they may have moved in the other direction as well. There may have been a bidirectional movement over centuries. But we won't know that they're Longobards because thus far we have not found their personal passports or IDs saying, I am a Longobard, or I'm not a Longobard, I'm just part of the cemetery. We will not find out which are the real Longobards and which are something else based on their genetics. We will not find out which Italians today are descended from the Longobards. The Northern League might like to know, but we won't be able to help them. We will not find out if the barbarian migrations destroyed the Roman Empire. Can't tell from genetics. Should Europe revise its modern immigration policies? If I could guarantee this, I could fund this project. And depending on what I promise to be the results, I could get right-wing money or left-wing money. But what might we learn? Well, we might learn to what extent these cemeteries are structured. You know, looking at these SNPs, these single nucleotide polymorphisms. We may find out about biological relationships between these different kinds of cemeteries and find out, is this a single population with different cultural practices, or are they really different populations? We might find out, are there distinct cultural groups? Is there a difference? Are men in these cemeteries not so much related to the women in the cemeteries? These are some of the things we might learn, including, is there continuity between pre- and post-migration Longobardic cemeteries? Not that they're necessarily Longobards, and we may very well find that the Longobards have the same genetic profile as the Romans, that in fact one could hypothesize they're simply provincials. That was part of the Roman Empire, who are now coming home. Challenges in this little project. International cross-disciplinary collaboration, true collaboration, not just using each other as an auxiliary science, as a helper to plug in data. educating geneticists, historians, archaeologists on what we do. What are the limits of our disciplines? What are the problems that we face? This means a lot of time talking together. We've had some long meetings, we're having some longer meetings, just to talk about our disciplines. Not that we're going to become geneticists or archaeologists, but we have to learn what this is. We have to demystify the other discipline, but also calm people down about their fears. This is a killer. Getting valid sequence data from old specimens is always a nightmare, and this has been a problem for a long time. Developing models to recover probable histories. It's hard enough with the non-recumbent DNA. It's a nightmare with DNA that in theory could recombine every generation. Then every point, in theory, every locus on the genome could have its own genealogy. 3 billion points, it really eats up a lot of computer time. So our mathematicians have to simplify this for us and make it easy. Finding the $450,000. Please lock the doors. Nobody leaves without a contribution. What is the payoff in all this? I think we will create a model for rigorous examination of population changes. People are working toward it. We're not the only ones, though we're the only ones trying to do something on this scale. But we need something that is replicable. We're going to learn best practices and share it. And we will share our database. We're going to create an ancient DNA database, which absolutely does not exist. There are other groups that are beginning tentatively to do this, and we want to link to them so that one could eventually have a map of ancient DNA in this period. I hope we'll have a model for reinterpreting historical and archaeological evidence along with genomic evidence. It's not that this is going to replace that, but they must be interconnected, and we have to show how that can be done. I hope beyond the process, that we'll start estimating diversity across the boundaries. We're not looking for essentialism, Romans, Lombards, barbarians, Franks. We're trying to preserve the diversity, the hybridity of Europe's populations on both sides of the boundaries of this world. Perhaps we can start estimating numbers of those who actually did move in or possibly moved out. Was it elite migration? Was it culture transfer? Are there significant population movements? And probably the answer is it depends on where. But at least we can start that. Possibly an estimate of the lasting demographic impact, if any, of these. This is my dream, but it may not happen. A start at separating historical from political interpretations of antiquity. We'll never get beyond it, but we're trying. New ways of understanding the complexity, the heterogeneity, the malleability of Europe's population in the past, and just maybe, perhaps, we'll be able to say something that is useful for us in a dynamic way about the present and the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You're willing to answer a few questions.
I didn't think I had a choice.
Yes.
This is Albwin, by the way. He's later murdered by his wife, whose father he murdered.
Just wait for the microphone.
Okay.
Thank you. Really interesting. Thank you so much. I was wondering, early on, you made a really big point about not being able to trust ancient DNA because it had been so sullied for so many reasons. How are you going to trust the ancient DNA you're going to use?
It depends on what you mean by trust the ancient DNA. There are various ways to interpret that. Do we believe that what we're getting is actually the DNA of these people who died in 580? That's a major question. Early ancient DNA analyses, whether it was of mammoths or prehistoric bison or Neanderthals, was actually the DNA of the scientists doing the analysis.
contamination is an enormous problem in ancient DNA. Fortunately, this is a very rapidly moving field. And in the last 10 years, there have been significant advances made that, in a way, actually uses the degradation of the DNA as a control. If the DNA is too good, it obviously isn't good. It's recent. So there are ways to do this. We're taking from each one, we're taking 3 samples. Sequencing is done in totally different laboratories. A laboratory in Barcelona is doing it, as well as our lab. If the results conflict, then there's obviously a problem. So trusting DNA in that way, it is a real problem. There are other statistical ways of judging that this is ancient DNA rather than modern DNA, but this is a very deep technical problem that my geneticists in the team are very aware of and working very hard to control. But that's one thing. The other question of trusting ancient DNA, meaning that this is telling us something significant about the population, well, that's the same problem as trusting written texts and archaeological texts. And texts don't lie, but people lie with texts. So it's a question of knowing what to ask. All we're looking at are variations in what will be printed out as terabytes of letters. And one question is, are we actually getting the sequence that actually exists in the genome? The other question is, what does it mean? And there we can't simply say its meaning is obvious, unlike the humanists' failure to find meaning. It's when we look at it, once we start analyzing it, then we have to work together as a team so that we can come up with a trustworthy explanation of what this means. So both are issues. Trusting ancient DNA is problematic. And I guarantee you that our results will be disputed by other scholars, by other geneticists, by other historians, and by the other archaeologists. Just the nature of what we do. Thank you for the question.
Hi, hello, it was excellent talk. I'm an economic historian, ancient economic historian, and you mentioned the interdisciplinary approach. Let me just proffer the ideas of the barbarian coins, the so-called barbarian coins of the period you're discussing. There might be some way of including that in these studies. And the second quick comment, I remember in Europe I picked up some trashy Nazi pamphlet, 2000 years of Deutsche Kultur, and I'm wondering whether one could compare these things to this. And last but not least, those interesting female jewelry, the fibula, the pins that held up the togas. One can buy them on eBay. I bought a few, and they're painted enameled. But I've gotten the ones that were broken for $5 or $10. Of course, they could be fakes, but for $10, what
let's hope they're fakes. But certainly, when I talk about historical sources or archaeological sources, I mean that in a very broad sense. So numismatics is certainly a part of the issue. Now, these peoples are not minting coins at the time that they are doing this, but there's some very interesting barbarian coins or medallions that are produced outside of the empire, some of them copying Roman forms, some of them actually better quality silver than you would say they're counterfeit, except that their fineness is greater than the Roman coins that they're counterfeiting. So then you have
donut-looking coins that look
yeah. Well, there are a lot of questions about the flow of precious metals, and these people tend to be, and all of this stuff that they've got, all of this gold and silver, they're buried in their tombs, these beautiful swords. This is the emperor's gold. They are being paid either in service to the empire, they're the Roman army, or they are getting it in as part of a treaty in which the Romans find that it's cheaper to send them gold than to fight them. They pay for an army. It's easier to bribe them off. So there's a lot to be done with the flow with the existence of precious metals within these societies, and also where it's from. And metallurgical analysis is very interesting. Where does the gold come from? Is it mined locally, for example, in the Iberian Peninsula, or is it coming from the Eastern Mediterranean or even beyond? And the same with the jewelry. Where are the stones coming from? Some of the stones are coming from Sri Lanka, pretty extraordinary. Others are local. So there's a lot, this is the kind of technical complexity that is involved in what we do. And we're just adding another layer of complexity. So this is not a genomic project, all genomes all the time. That's just one more little trace. We have the written evidence, archaeological evidence. Now we're going to add genetic evidence. And one does not trump the other, and they tell different parts of the story, and you cannot answer questions about culture and identity through genomics, just as we can't answer questions about population movement through our texts. So we just have to work together.
Okay. Yes.
Last?
Yes.
How are you dealing or planning to deal with the media and with various political groups or nationalist groups that take interest in this?
This is a very serious problem. And this is a problem that has already begun. Some people are saying, oh, Gary's trying to get the lumber gene. There is an immediate reaction, oh, this is racial essentializing. This guy is going back to the 1930s. I hope no one here is going to go out and report that. This talk is being videotaped, will be on the internet, so it'll be very interesting if anyone looks at it to see what kind of fan mail and hate mail I receive. As our project produces results, inevitably it is likely to be picked up and will be involved in, people will use it as ammunition. And that is right. And it's a problem in how do scholars interface with their contemporary world? We have our personal beliefs. We have what we do. What happens, I've gone on record, I've written a book called The Myth of Nations, which gives a pretty good idea of where I stand on these population identities and so forth. What if I find that these are absolutely tight, endogenous communities that have held together for centuries and moved massively into the Roman Empire and preserved their identity, which is exactly what I don't think happened. It'll be interesting for me. I don't think it'll happen, but there are other people in the team who pretty much believe that that's what happened. And as I enlisted them, I said, well, let's get the data so that we can discuss it. Once it gets to the public sphere, what a Geert Wilders will do with this, what ethnic nationalists might do with this, we simply have to be careful about how we discuss the importance of the past for the present, but the fundamental difference between the two. History is a study of change in human society over time. It is not the search for primordial identities. And whatever this population was in the 6th century, it is not what we are today. And that's simply the reality, but there is a very strong desire within certain parts, not only of Europe, but of the world, to erase past and present and have an eternal moment. I fully agree that there could be problems. Fortunately, there is no Longobarд nationalist movement. And
because this is being taped and televised, I will not podcast. I will not talk about those that do exist and those groups that we might have studied, but we decided not to, because the moment we would try to, we would run into serious problems in getting our hands on the data or getting some of our international colleagues in a lot of trouble if they collaborated. Nobody is really holding out for the Longobards, so they kind of pass under the radar. I hope what we will have is a model that can be applied then to study other population changes in other places. And I hope that what we are preserving, particularly with our work in autosomal DNA, is complexity, hybridity. This is not tracing your mother back to Eve or your father back to Adam. This is looking at the complexity of these people as well as the complexity of those that produced them and those that came after. And I suspect that if this goes forward, it will be abused, but that's also part of being a contemporary intellectual in the world, and so we'll have to go on talk shows and try to explain, or we'll get Robert to explain, because he's much better at that, what we're doing here. But inevitably, you get mixed up in this when you talk about these issues.
Perhaps a final question.
To what extent are genetic differences in these fairly recent peoples sufficient to enable one to analyze the migrations of these people, in particular those where the migrations are known, like the Vikings going into southern Italy or the...
Well, that's a very good question. Obviously, real mutation takes place randomly, but over centuries, millennia. And so one question is, will we see any difference? These people are just like us. We're not going to see evolutionary differences here. There are people who are studying Neanderthal DNA and finding out how much how much of the Neanderthal genome is present in us, and some of us know people that we think have more than others. But here we're looking at very small differences. We looked at the hypervariable region 1 of the mitochondria because that is an area that is known to undergo a lot of changes in a fairly short period of time. That study that I criticized for its data using the Lausanne material, although the data I think is very weak, the science is actually very strong. And their attempt to look at segments, the recombination does not happen at every point of the genome in every moment, but it happens by segments. And they have some very interesting ways of trying to estimate time based on length of identity, by common identity by descent. And so there are mathematical ways that we think we may be able to see these similarities if we're looking deeply enough. If we're just looking at mitochondria and Y chromosomal DNA, then, as somebody said, the European gene pool has been vegetable soup since the Paleolithic, at least. There's no difference. There is no real difference. But if you look today at a map, a genetic map showing genetic distance, again, not modeled, but just using principal component analysis, looking at thousands of loci in the genome, you actually, a colleague, one of our participants, John November, published a very interesting article in Nature in which simply plotting genetic distance on a two-dimensional graph, he replicated Europe's geographical map. you can see Scandinavia, you can see England, you can see the Iberian Peninsula, you can see Italy, even though he's using the same lousy database from Lausanne. If he had really good data, it would be fascinating. But so we know that there is sufficient difference in modern DNA to find differences. But what he does not find are lots of isolates, evidence of big migrations moving into an area. The extraordinary discovery is that people tend to have sex with people that they're close to. Think about it. And the result is that it's a very gradual process. And I participated in a study in which people thought maybe the Sorbs, which is a Slavic isolate community around Leipzig, were maybe the Serbs, and that was part of the great Serbian nation, which had been cut off by Germans and so forth. And in fact, they fit pretty much where they should be. They're a slight isolate. They're a little closer to Bohemia and Poland, but they pretty much fit where they should. So you can do a map. The question is, what would we have during the so-called migration period? Would we have the same even map, and the Lombards would, in northern Italy would just look like the rest of northern Italy, and they would not look like Hungary? We don't know. It's an interesting question. But it's possible, using next-generation sequencing, to get rich enough data from even ancient DNA to pose these questions. And ask me after I get my $450,000, and I hope I can answer it.
Okay, Patrick. On behalf of, I really want to thank you for a fascinating and also very entertaining and funny lecture, confronting us with, in many ways, what we do not know, and just dazzling complexity of all the various different approaches and angles and problems. And I must say it's very comforting that all of this is coming together in the mind of a single historian, a particular historian here at the IAS. So thank you again, and really I would like to invite all of you to attend the reception in Fuld Hall. Thank you again.